Orchestrated entirely new Western narrative, with fresh character names and plot structure. Orchestrated entirely new Western narrative, with fresh character names and plot structure. The door of the bakery slammed back so hard, a tin of cinnamon leapt off the shelf and rolled across the floorboards, and the man who filled the doorway looked like he had not slept in a week or eaten in 2. Folks in Bishop Crossing knew that face. They crossed the street when they saw it coming. Asa Whitlock stood near 7 feet of leather and shoulder, a burn scar dragging the left side of his jaw down toward his collar, and the whole bakery went quiet, the way a room goes quiet when a storm cloud passes over the sun. The Pruitt sisters at the counter clutched their parcels. Old Mr. Dell by the door forgot to chew. "I need a wife," Asa said. His voice came out cracked, like a hinge that hadn't moved in years. "I need a wife by tomorrow." Nobody laughed. That was the strange part. A man saying a thing like that in a bakery on a Tuesday ought to have got a laugh. But there wasn't a soul in that room who could find one, because the most feared man in the county, the one the children dared each other to look at, was standing there with his hat crushed in 2 enormous hands, and his eyes wet at the rims, and he was begging. Lena Brightwell did not stop sliding the loaf pans. She had a baker's hands, quick and sure, and she finished setting the bread to cool before she even turned around. 28 years old and a head shorter than most of the men who came through her door, she had buried more people than she was old enough to have buried, and learned somewhere along the way that the loudest moment in a room is rarely the most dangerous one. "You'll want to say that quieter," she told him, "or say it in the back." The whole bakery exhaled at once. Asa looked at her like she was the first person in a long while who hadn't flinched. "There's a man coming on tomorrow's train," he said, "from the territorial office. He's coming to take the boy." "What boy?" "My brother's boy, Caleb." Asa's jaw worked. "Ezra and his wife drowned at the Sweetwater Ford in the spring. Wagon went over in the high water. Caleb watched it happen from the bank. He stopped, and for a second the giant looked like he might come apart right there on her clean floor. He hasn't said a word since. Not one. 7 years old, and he won't talk. And the office says a man like me, living the way I live, alone with my—" He gestured vaguely at his own ruined face, his own reputation. "With all of it, I'm not fit. They've got a place in Denver, an institution, for boys who don't speak." He swallowed. "If I don't have a family by the time that man steps off the train, they take him, and I will never get him back." Lena wiped her hands slowly on her apron. "Mrs. Tilley," she called over her shoulder, to the gray-haired woman kneading at the far table, "watch the counter a minute. Lena, you don't want to be alone with." "5 minutes," Lena said, in the quiet voice she used for exactly these moments, and she lifted the hinged board and walked toward the back room, as if Asa Whitlock were a customer come to argue about the price of rolls. The storeroom smelled of flour and yeast and wood smoke. Asa had to stoop to come through the door, and once he was inside, the room shrank around him. Up close she could see the things she'd missed from across the counter. The gray threading early through his dark hair, the way his hands shook, the dried blood under one fingernail where he'd worked something raw. He was younger than the legend made him out to be. Younger and more frightened. "Sit," she said, and nodded at a flour barrel. He sat, and even sitting he was nearly her height. "You don't know me," he said. "I know what people say." "What people say is mostly true." He turned the hat over in his hands. "I came back from the war wrong. There was a fire at the depot in '74. They blame me for it. I won't tell you they're wrong about that either. I've put men down. I've lived up on the Bracken place by myself for 6 years because it's better for everyone that I do. And now there's a child sleeping in my dead brother's bed who won't look at me, and a man on a train who's going to take him to a building full of them strangers. And I cannot." His voice broke clean in half. "I can't let that happen to him. Whatever else I am, I can't." Lena was quiet a while. Outside, a wagon rattled past, and a dog barked at it, and somewhere a child was laughing. All the ordinary noise of a town going about its Tuesday, while a man fell apart in her storeroom. "Why me?" she asked finally. "You walked past 4 houses with marriageable women in them to get to my door." "Because they'd have screamed," he said simply. "You didn't even drop the pan." In spite of everything, the corner of her mouth moved. "And because," he went on, lower now, "the boy needs feeding and looking after, and somebody who knows how to make a house feel like one. I can shoe a horse and skin a deer, and not much else. You run a bakery alone at 28. Folks talk about your bread 2 towns over." He looked at his hands. "I'm not asking for a wife the way most men mean it. I'm asking you to stand next to me tomorrow and let that man see a family. I'll deed you the upper field. I'll never come near you. You can keep this place. He couldn't finish. That was when Lena asked the question that changed the shape of both their lives. though neither of them knew it then. She did not ask about money or land or what the town would say. She crouched down so she was eye level with him on his flour barrel, and she said, "When the boy wakes screaming in the night, and he will, you understand. A child who watched that doesn't stop screaming for years. When that happens, who sits with him? You or me?" Asa stared at her. Of everything he'd braced for, that wasn't it. "I don't know how," he admitted. "I tried. He won't have me." "Then that's my one condition," Lena said. "Not the field, not the bakery." She held his gaze. "If I do this, I'm not a sign you wave at a man off a train. I'm the one who sits with him in the dark. I'm his all the way, or I'm nothing to either of you. I won't pretend a child into safety and then hand him back his loneliness when the inspector's gone. Decide right now whether you can let me belong to him, because I won't do it halfway." For a long moment Asa Whitlock could not speak at all. Then he nodded once, and a tear cut straight down through the dust on his ruined cheek, and he said, "Yes, God help me, yes." She married him the next morning at 8:30 in the front room of Reverend Stowe's house, with Mrs. Tilley and the Reverend's wife as witnesses, and the smell of the Reverend's burnt breakfast still hanging in the air. Lena wore her good gray dress, the one she kept for funerals, which struck her as either very wrong or very right, and she couldn't decide which. Asa wore a coat that had clearly been hung in a trunk for a decade, and smelled of cedar. His hands shook so badly, he dropped the ring twice, and the second time it rolled under the settee, and they both had to get down on the floor to find it. And that was the first time Lena heard him laugh. A short, rusty, astonished sound, like he'd surprised himself. Then the train came in. The man from the territorial office was named Corwin Pace, and he was thin and dry and precise. With spectacles he kept polishing on a clean white handkerchief, and he did not shake Asa's hand. He looked at the marriage certificate. He looked at Lena's gray dress and her flour-cracked knuckles. He looked at Asa's scar a half-second too long. "This is sudden," Pace said. "We've been acquainted some time," Lena said, which was a lie, and she said it so smoothly that even Asa nearly believed her. "Mr. Whitlock is a private man. He didn't see the need to announce his business to the town until the business concerned the boy." Pace polished his spectacles. "I'll need to see the residence, observe the child, make my assessment over the coming weeks. The office does not hand a grieving, mute child to a household on the strength of a Tuesday wedding." "Come and see it then," Lena said. "Come and stay as long as you need." And so the strangest household in the territory loaded into Asa's wagon and drove up out of Bishop Crossing toward the Bracken place, with the inspector following on a hired horse, and the boy waiting for them at the top of the road. She saw Caleb before he saw her. He was sitting on the porch step of the gray cabin, with his knees drawn up and his arms around them, a small boy in clothes too big for him. His father's old shirt, she'd learn later, the only thing of Ezra's he'd let anyone keep on him. Beside him sat a carpet bag, the one he'd been packed off in, with one tin soldier and a child's primer and a hair ribbon that had been his mother's, and nothing else in the world. He watched the wagon come up the road with the flat, careful stillness of an animal deciding whether to bolt. Lena did not rush him. She climbed down, and she did not crouch in his face or coo at him, or say any of the foolish things grown people say to frightened children. She walked up to the porch, sat down on the step beside him, close, but not touching, and looked out at the same view he was looking at, the long brown valley and the blue wall of mountains beyond, and after a while she said, "I bake bread. I brought some. It's still warm if you want it, and if you don't, it'll keep." Caleb said nothing, but he did not move away from her either, and when she set the heel of a fresh loaf on the step between them, his small dirty hand crept out very slowly and took it. Corwin Pace, writing in his little book by the wagon, made a note. The first nights were the hardest, exactly as she had told Asa they would be. The cabin was bigger than she'd expected and emptier. Asa had built it for one man's grief, and it showed all hard surfaces and no softness anywhere, the kind of place where a child could feel like a guest who had overstayed. Lena went to work on it the way she went to work on a stubborn dough. She hung a curtain. She filled the cold hearth and kept it filled. She made the small room that had been Ezra's into Caleb's room, and set the tin soldier on the windowsill where he could see it from the bed, and his mother's ribbon she tied around the bedpost where the boy could touch it in the dark. And in the dark, just as she'd promised, the screaming came. The first night it woke her, she was up and across the cabin, before Asa had even got his boots on. She found Caleb sitting bolt upright in the tangled quilt, soaked through with sweat, his mouth open in a scream that made no sound at all. And that was the worst of it, she thought, that the boy who would not speak still could not even cry out loud when the dream took him, that the river had stolen even that. She did not grab him. She sat down on the edge of the bed, and she started to talk, low and steady, about nothing, about how she'd learned to bake from a woman named Sister Agnes at the orphan home where she'd grown up, about the trick of knowing when bread is done by the sound it makes when you knock the bottom of the loaf, hollow like a little drum. And she kept on until the boy's breathing slowed, and his eyes came back from wherever they'd gone, and at last, without a word, he tipped sideways and put his head against her arm. She stayed until morning. She stayed the next night too, and the next. Asa stood in the doorway, those nights, helpless, his great hands hanging at his sides, watching this small woman do the one thing he had not been able to do for the child he loved. He never came in. He thought he wasn't allowed. It took Lena 3 nights to understand that, and on the 4th, when the dream had passed and Caleb had drifted off again, she looked up at the man filling the doorway and said softly, "He's not afraid of you. He's afraid you don't want him. Those aren't the same thing. Come sit down." Asa came and sat on the floor by the bed because the chair wouldn't take his weight, and he was so big and the room was so small that his knees came up nearly to his chin, and Lena had to press her hand to her mouth to keep from laughing. And that was the second time she heard him laugh, quieter than the first, both of them trying not to wake the boy. That was the night the household started to turn into something it hadn't been the day before. She did not abandon the bakery, because she had promised the boy she'd belong to him, and you could not belong to a child while running yourself ragged on a wagon road twice a day. But she had built that bakery with her own 2 hands out of nothing, after a girlhood that had given her nothing, and she would not simply let it die either. So she did the sensible thing that, in stories, people too often forget to do. She made an arrangement. Her apprentice, a sharp 17-year-old named Hetty Dunmore, who had been learning the trade for 2 years, and was hungry for it the way Lena had once been hungry, took over the daily baking. Lena rode down 3 mornings a week to keep the books and bake the special orders and stand at the counter, so Bishop Crossing could see for itself that the strange Mrs. Whitlock was alive and well, and not being held captive on a mountain. The town talked anyway. The town always talked, but the bread kept coming, and Hetty's hands grew surer by the week, and within a season there were folks who swore the girl's sourdough had outrun her teacher's, which Lena said, to anyone who'd listen, was the finest thing an apprentice could do to her. Corwin Pace stayed 2 weeks the first visit, and came back twice more across the autumn, and watched everything. He watched Lena teach Caleb his letters at the kitchen table, with a slate, the boy still silent, but writing now, careful block letters, answering her questions in chalk. He watched Asa, and this was the thing Pace had not expected to watch. Sit on the floor by the fire of an evening and carve, because it turned out the blacksmith's enormous burned hands could do delicate work with a knife and a block of pine. And what he carved were animals, a fox, a heron, a leaping trout, and he set each one on the windowsill beside the tin soldier without a word. An offering left where the boy would find it, and never once asked for thanks. Pace watched the small silent boy line those animals up in a careful row and rearrange them, hour after hour, and watched the day the boy carried one, the fox, to where Asa sat hammering at the forge, and set it on the anvil's edge, and waited, until the big man understood that he was being given something back. Asa held that little fox in his palm a long time before he could speak. "Thank you," he said, rough. The boy nodded, grave as a judge, and went back to the house. Pace wrote in his book. The cold came on early that year. Snow filled the pass and shrank the world down to the cabin and the forge and the barn and the white road that led nowhere a body could reach quickly. Inside, the household closed in on itself in the good way, the way a hand closes warm around something it means to keep. Lena learned that Asa hummed when he worked the leather and didn't know he did it. Asa learned that Lena talked to her bread, scolded it, encouraged it, and didn't know she did it either, and that the boy had started to smile when she did. They learned each other's silences, which is the real work of a marriage, far more than the words. And one evening, watching Caleb fall asleep against Asa's enormous arm with the firelight on all 3 of their faces, Lena understood that the thing she had agreed to as a kindness to a stranger had become, without her noticing the moment it happened, the only place on earth she wanted to be. She did not say so, neither did he. But he started taking the long way past her at the table so his shoulder would brush hers, and she started leaving a 3rd chair pulled up to the fire even on the nights the boy was already abed. And that was its own kind of speaking. Then the assessment came due. Corwin Pace arrived on a hard bright morning in December with the last of his paperwork and a face that gave away nothing. He asked his questions one final time. How often did the child eat, and what? Was he learning? Was he frightened? He asked to speak with Caleb alone, and Lena's heart climbed into her throat, but she only knelt by the boy and said, "Tell him the truth, sweetheart. Whatever it is, you don't have to protect us," and she sent him in. It was the longest hour of her life. Asa wore a path in the snow outside the window. Lena could not sit, could not stand, could not do anything but watch the closed door and the steam of her own breath. When at last the door opened and Corwin Pace stepped out with the boy behind him, his thin, dry face was unreadable as a stone. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitlock," he said. "Whatever you've decided," Asa said, and his voice was shaking. "I'd ask you to know that I'd lay down in front of that train before I let." "Mr. Whitlock." Pace held up a hand. He took off his spectacles and polished them, and for the first time in all those weeks there was something almost human in the gesture, something tired. "When I came up this road in September, I had already written my report in my head. A scarred recluse with a violent history and a marriage 1 day old. The office expected a recommendation for removal. I expected to write it." He folded the handkerchief. "I have removed 11 children in 9 years. I have learned to tell, fairly quickly, where a child is merely housed and where a child is held." He put his spectacles back on, and he looked, of all places, at the windowsill, at the row of carved animals catching the morning light. "I asked the boy in there if he was happy," Pace said. "He cannot speak, as you know, so he took my pencil." He turned his little book around. On the open page, in a child's careful block letters, was written one word: "Home." Lena's hand went to her mouth. Us made a sound she'd never heard a grown man make. "The child stays," Corwin Pace said. "The office will hear no more of it, and if anyone ever raises the matter again, Mr. Whitlock, you will send them to me." He closed his book. "I have a long ride, Mrs. Whitlock. I don't suppose I might buy a loaf for the road." She gave him 3 and would not take his money, and he rode away down the white road and out of their lives. And behind him, Asa Whitlock dropped to his knees in the snow and gathered the boy up against his chest and wept without any shame at all. And Caleb led him and put his thin arms as far around the giant's neck as they would reach. It would have made a fine ending there. It was not the end. The fever came in February, the way fever always comes, in the dead heart of winter when help is farthest off. Caleb woke one morning with his cheeks too red and his eyes too bright, and a heat coming off him you could feel from across the room, and by midday he could not keep down water, and by dark his breath had gone to a shallow rattle that Lena had heard once before in her life, and had prayed never to hear again. 'Cause she had heard it before. That was the thing she had not told Asa. The wound under all her steadiness. The reason she had asked him that first question in the storeroom about who sits in the dark. Lena Brightwell had grown up in an orphan home, and had raised, in that home, a little sister named May, who was not her blood sister at all, but had become so. A small, bright, fierce thing she had taught to read and braided every morning, and loved past all sense. And when the fever swept the home the winter Lena was 16, she had hesitated. Just a night. She had told herself May was only tired, that the doctor cost money the sisters didn't have, that it would pass by morning, and in the morning May was gone. Lena had carried that one night of hesitation for 12 years like a stone sewn into her ribs. She did not hesitate now. "Saddle the horse," she said to Asa, and there was iron in it. "Go get Doc Hale. Don't you stop for the snow. Don't you stop for anything. Bring him at the point of a gun if he won't come for the Whitlock name." Asa was gone before she finished, out into the blizzard on the fastest horse he owned, and Lena was alone with the burning child and 12 years of her own ghost standing at the foot of the bed. She did everything. She stripped the quilts and cooled him with snow melt and lifted his head to make him drink when he fought her. She talked the whole time, about May, about the bakery, about every foolish, hopeful thing she could lay her tongue to, because she had learned that the talking was a rope you threw to a child who was sinking, and you did not stop throwing it, not for anything. Not even when your own arms were giving out. Asa came back near dawn, half frozen, with Doc Hale behind him, the old doctor's beard white with ice. Hale worked fast. He listened to the boy's chest, and got medicine down him, and said the words Lena had been dreading and praying against in the same breath. "The fever has to break tonight. If it breaks, he'll mend. If it doesn't." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. So they waited. It is a particular kind of long, the wait at the bedside of a child whose life is balanced on a thread you cannot touch. Asa paced until Lena made him stop. Doc Hale dozed upright in the chair, the way old country doctors learn to sleep anywhere. Lena held the small hot hand and did not let go and did not stop talking, hour after hour, while the storm threw itself against the cabin and the lamp burned low and the night went on and on without any mercy in it at all. Near 3 in the morning, the boy's hand turned cool in hers. For one black instant, her heart stopped dead, because she had felt a hand go cool before. Then she understood. Not cool like the river. Cool like a fever breaking. The terrible heat was draining out of him, and his breath was deepening, easing, the rattle smoothing out into the long, slow rhythm of true sleep. And when she laid her palm against his forehead, it was only warm now, only a sleeping child, only her boy, alive. She put her face down against the quilt and shook. And then a voice, small, hoarse, cracked from disuse and roughened by fever, a voice not one of them had heard in nearly a year, said very faintly from the pillow, "Mama, you're crying." Lena's head came up. Caleb was looking at her. His eyes were clear, and he had said it. The boy who had not spoken since the river closed over his parents had opened his mouth in the dead of a winter night, and the first word in it, the very first, was a name he had no reason on this earth to give her. And he had given it to her anyway, because somewhere in the long dark she had become it. She could not answer. She gathered him up instead, careful of his weak small body, and held him. And over the top of his head she found Asa standing frozen in the doorway with both hands pressed to his mouth and tears standing in his eyes. And Doc Hale awake in his chair now, beaming through his frozen beard, and not a soul in that room able to say a single word, because the only person who needed to speak already had. Caleb mended slow, the way Doc Hale promised, week for a week, and then suddenly, the way children do, not weak at all. He did not become a chatterer overnight. He kept his quiet ways, chose his words like a man counting coins. But the words came now, more of them every day, and each one landed in that house like the first warm rain after a hard year. The spring thaw opened the pass, and the household came down off the mountain, and back into the life of the town, no longer quite so strange to anyone. Because a thing stops being frightening once people have watched it love a child through a fever. Hetty Dunmore had kept the bakery running so well through the winter that Lena made her a partner in the spring, painted both their names on the window, and split her own weeks between the warm flower-smelling front room in town and the cabin up the road, and never once felt she'd had to choose, because she'd built it so she wouldn't have to. Asa took on Caleb at the forge as the weather warmed, taught him to pump the bellows, and then, when he was bigger, to swing the small hammer, and the boy who had come to them clutching one tin soldier grew into a lanky, talkative thing who could mend a broken hinge by the time he was 10, and who called the giant with the ruined face Pa so naturally that strangers never guessed there'd been any other way of it. They never did say the words to each other, Lena and Asa. Not the grand ones, the ones people say in stories. They didn't need them. He learned the way she took her coffee and had it waiting. She learned the names of all his nightmares and sat with him through them the same as she sat with the boy. Somewhere in the second winter, the third chair by the fire stopped being a thing she pulled up on purpose and became simply where he sat, next to her, every night, his shoulder against hers, the two of them watching the boy read aloud by the firelight. And if you had asked either of them to point to the day the arrangement had turned into a marriage, and the marriage into a love, neither could have done it. It had happened the way the bread rises, slow, in the warm dark, when no one is watching, until one morning the thing is simply whole. Years on, when Caleb was grown and gone off to learn the smith's trade properly in Denver, of all places, the very city that had once meant to swallow him, he would come back up the mountain every spring with a bag full of city sweets nobody on the Bracken place needed and didn't care. And he would sit on that same porch step, where Lena had first set a warm loaf between them, now a tall young man with his uncle's careful hands and his mother's ribbon kept folded in his breast pocket, and he would look out at the long green valley and the blue mountains and not say much, the way he'd always not said much, and Lena would sit down beside him, close but not touching, the way she had the very first day, and after a while one of them would speak. The cabin still stands up there. Smoke still rises from the chimney on cold mornings, and the carved animals still line the windowsill. Faded now, the fox worn smooth as river stone from all the hands that have held it. And the people who knew the whole of it, and there are fewer of them every year, will tell you that the most dangerous man in the county was never dangerous at all, only broken, and that a baker with flour on her knuckles walked into his ruin one Tuesday and saw, where everyone else saw, a monster, a man holding out his cracked open heart, and a little boy who hadn't spoken in a year, and that she didn't even drop the pan. I keep coming back to the pan she didn't drop. A man the whole county was afraid of came crashing through that bakery door, half out of his mind, and while everyone else in the room turned to stone, Lena Brightwell finished sliding her bread to cool before she even looked up. That half second has stayed with me for years, because nearly everything good that followed grew straight out of it. She looked at Asa Whitlock and didn't see the monster the town had built him into. She saw a terrified father holding his cracked open heart out across the counter, and she had the clear eye to tell the difference. Most of us never learn that. We see the scar and the reputation, and we cross the street, and we tell ourselves we were being careful. She was being honest. There's a difference, and the whole story turns on it. What I admire even more is the condition she set. She didn't ask Asa for the field or the bakery. She asked who would sit with the boy when he woke screaming in the dark, and she said she'd only do it if she could belong to that child all the way through. She understood something I had to learn the hard way myself. That you cannot half love a frightened person into safety, and then take it back when it's convenient. A child knows the difference between being housed and being held. Caleb knew. He wrote one word in that inspector's book, and it wasn't a clever word. It was just home. And then there was the fever. Lena had buried a little sister named May once, years before, because she let one night of doubt talk her into waiting, and she carried that stone in her chest the whole rest of her life. So when Caleb burned hot and his breath went shallow, she did not hesitate. Not for the snow, not for the cost, not for anything. She sent Asa out into the blizzard, and she stayed at that bedside and threw words like a rope to a sinking boy, until his fever broke at 3 a.m. and he opened his eyes and called her Mama. That is what carrying a hard lesson is supposed to do. It's supposed to make you faster next time. Braver. Less willing to lose. I think that's the whole shape of it. Seeing people truly even when it costs you. Refusing to do love by halves. And finding the grit to keep showing up at the bedside, the forge, the table, every single day, long after the dramatic moment has passed. Those 3 things made a family out of a baker, a feared man, and a silent child. They weren't born with any of it. They built it. The way Lena built her bread, slow, in the warm dark, until the broken thing was finally whole.